war that stole Ukraine's spotlight. When wars collide, they rarely do so politely. They jostle for attention, for material, for diplomatic oxygen, and, occasionally, for history's verdict. The widening conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran has therefore produced an awkward question in Kyiv: what happens to Ukraine when the world's gaze swivels elsewhere? For 3 years, the war between Russia and Ukraine has occupied a peculiar place in global politics, simultaneously central and peripheral. Central, because it represented the most serious interstate war in Europe since 1945. Peripheral, because the rest of the world never quite treated it as an existential crisis. Beyond Europe and Washington's policy circles, many viewed it as a regional conflict with global implications, not a standalone world war. Now the Middle East threatens to reassert its ancient prerogative as the planet's geopolitical center of gravity. If the conflict with Iran escalates into a sustained regional war, the Ukrainian battlefield, no matter how bloody, may find itself relegated to the margins of strategic debate. For President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has spent much of his presidency persuading the world that Ukraine's war is everyone's war, the timing could scarcely be worse. A war that competes for attention, in an age of permanent crisis. Attention has become a strategic resource. Governments possess only so much of it, electorates even less. The United States has developed a pattern of geopolitical multitasking that usually ends with one theater absorbing most of the focus while others drift into neglect. The war in Ukraine has already lasted far longer than many in Washington initially expected. What began in 2022 as a dramatic and morally unambiguous struggle gradually hardened into a grinding war of attrition. Western enthusiasm, while still real, has cooled. Political attention spans have shortened. Into this fatigue steps the new confrontation with Iran. The Middle East possesses advantages Ukraine does not. It is the historical epicenter of American strategic engagement. The world's most important energy corridor, and the stage upon which American power has repeatedly been evaluated since the 1970s. When missiles fly across the Persian Gulf and oil markets tremble, Washington tends to notice. For Donald Trump, who has returned to the presidency promising decisive victories abroad, the Iranian confrontation offers something Ukraine does not: the prospect of a swift and demonstrable triumph. Ukraine, by contrast, has stubbornly refused to produce neat outcomes. Peace negotiations with Russia have dragged on inconclusively. Trump's efforts to position himself as the dealmaker capable of ending Europe's war have produced little more than diplomatic theater. The front line has shifted only marginally. The war's logic remains stubbornly attritional. If Trump can claim a dramatic victory against Iran, by crippling its military infrastructure or precipitating regime instability, the contrast with Ukraine would be stark. One conflict would appear decisive. The other is interminable. Political attention tends to follow perceived success, the supply problem, yet for Kyiv the consequences of the Middle Eastern war extend far beyond narrative and prestige. The more immediate concern is logistical. Wars require weapons, weapons require production, production requires prioritization. And in a world of finite arsenals, prioritization inevitably produces scarcity. Ukraine's dependence on Western air defense systems illustrates the problem vividly. Since Russia began its campaign of systematic strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure, Kyiv has relied heavily on advanced Western interceptors, most notably the American Patriot system, to protect cities and power stations from missile attacks. These interceptors are not infinite. At several points during the past winter, Ukrainian Patriot batteries sat idle for lack of PAC-3 interceptor missiles. The hardware remained intact, but the ammunition required to fire it had run out. Such shortages were temporary, but they revealed an uncomfortable truth: Western stockpiles were never designed for prolonged high-intensity warfare. The war with Iran threatens to strain those stockpiles further. Tehran's retaliatory strategy has relied heavily on ballistic missiles and long-range drones aimed at American and Allied facilities across the Middle East. Bases in Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates have all found themselves under threat. Israel, of course, remains the primary target. Intercepting such weapons requires exactly the systems Ukraine depends upon: if American commanders conclude that protecting Middle Eastern installations demands additional Patriot batteries or interceptor missiles, the supply chain may tilt away from Europe. Even a modest reallocation could be felt on the Ukrainian battlefield. Serhiy Kazan, a Ukrainian security analyst, has warned that the most negative scenario for Kyiv would involve Washington redirecting air defense resources to the Middle East. The logic is difficult to dispute. American troops stationed in the Gulf inevitably rank higher on the Pentagon's list of immediate responsibilities than Ukrainian cities. Strategic geography tends to be ruthless in such calculations. The arithmetic of war production. The problem is compounded by the slow expansion of Western defense production. During the early phases of the Ukraine war, Western governments promised a transformation of their military-industrial bases. Factories would expand. Supply chains would accelerate. Europe would rediscover the industrial capacity required for sustained conflict. Progress has been uneven. Production of artillery shells has increased significantly. Missile manufacturing, however, remains constrained by complex supply chains and specialized components. Interceptor missiles, particularly those designed to counter ballistic threats, require advanced guidance systems and propulsion technologies that cannot be manufactured overnight. Thus, a paradox emerges. Even as Western governments pledge unwavering support for Ukraine, the practical ability to sustain that support remains limited. The Middle Eastern war intensifies this dilemma. If Iranian missiles continue to rain down on American bases and Israeli cities, Washington may decide that maintaining robust air defense coverage across the Gulf is a strategic necessity. That decision would not necessarily end support for Ukraine, but it might stretch supply lines thinner than Kyiv can comfortably tolerate. Wars, after all, are governed by arithmetic. Europe's strategic distraction. The strain may not fall solely on American resources. Several of Ukraine's most committed European backers have also found themselves drawn into the Middle Eastern confrontation. Britain and France, both vocal supporters of Kyiv, maintain military facilities across the region. Some of these installations have been targeted during Iran's retaliatory strikes. European governments now face the awkward possibility that their own forces could become directly involved in defending regional bases or maritime routes. Protecting those interests might require diverting military assets, including air defense systems, away from Eastern Europe. The optics are delicate. For 3 years European leaders have framed Ukraine's struggle as a defense of the continent's security architecture. Yet if their own facilities come under threat in the Middle East, domestic political pressure will inevitably prioritize national protection over distant solidarity. Strategic commitments are rarely infinite. When crises multiply, priorities emerge. The diplomatic clock. Beyond the battlefield, the Middle Eastern war threatens to disrupt another fragile process: negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. The talks have produced little tangible progress. Still, they represent one of the few diplomatic channels through which the war might eventually be frozen or resolved. Their mere existence has allowed Washington to claim that diplomacy remains possible, but diplomacy requires attention. If the Trump administration becomes consumed by the confrontation with Iran, Ukraine may slip down the agenda. Negotiations already scheduled in Abu Dhabi have been postponed due to security concerns tied to the regional crisis. For Zelensky, this presents a difficult dilemma. On one hand, Ukraine benefits from sustained American involvement in negotiations, even if those talks yield few immediate results. On the other, the more Washington's attention drifts elsewhere, the greater the risk that Ukraine becomes a secondary issue. Some analysts fear an even more dramatic scenario, that Trump, frustrated by the lack of progress, might simply abandon the mediation effort altogether. That outcome would not end the war, but it would remove the political theater surrounding potential peace. Trump's search for victory. Donald Trump has always approached foreign policy through the lens of spectacle. The logic is straightforward. Complex diplomatic processes rarely produce headlines. Dramatic victories do. In Ukraine, however, the possibility of a swift triumph has proven elusive. Russia remains entrenched across large swathes of occupied territory. Ukrainian counteroffensives have struggled to break through fortified lines. Negotiations have stagnated. Iran offers a different kind of battlefield. the American military possesses overwhelming technological superiority. If the campaign succeeds in severely degrading Iranian military infrastructure, or even destabilizing the regime, the White House could claim a decisive victory. From a political perspective, such a triumph would overshadow the unresolved war in Ukraine. For Zelensky, this is an uncomfortable reality. Ukraine's cause has long depended on the moral clarity of resisting aggression. Yet moral clarity does not always translate into sustained political enthusiasm, especially when other crises promise quicker resolutions. Russia's calculated distance. One curious feature of the Iranian conflict has been Russia's relative restraint. Tehran and Moscow have developed an increasingly close partnership since the invasion of Ukraine. Iranian drones have played a prominent role in Russia's strike campaign. The two countries have signed defense agreements and expanded economic cooperation. Yet Moscow has shown little inclination to intervene militarily on Iran's behalf. This hesitation reflects careful calculation. Russia's strategic priority remains Ukraine. Direct confrontation with the United States in the Middle East would risk widening the conflict in ways Moscow cannot easily control. Moreover, Russia's military resources are already heavily committed to the Ukrainian front. By maintaining a cautious distance, Vladimir Putin preserves flexibility. Russia can continue benefiting from Iranian cooperation without entangling itself in Tehran's immediate battles. The Kremlin's restraint also carries an ironic implication. While Ukraine fears losing Western attention to the Iranian war, Russia may quietly welcome that distraction, a silver lining in Tehran's troubles. Despite these concerns, Kiev has identified several potential advantages in the Middle Eastern conflict. The most obvious lies in the damage inflicted upon Iran's military infrastructure. Iran has been one of Russia's most important wartime partners. When Moscow required enormous quantities of inexpensive long-range drones, Tehran supplied them. The Shahid series, now produced under Russian license, became a staple of Russia's nightly bombardments of Ukrainian cities. American and Israeli strikes targeting Iranian drone factories and missile facilities could therefore indirectly benefit Ukraine. Every destroyed production line reduces Tehran's ability to supply Moscow with weapons. Even if Russia has begun manufacturing its own variants in facilities such as the Alabuga Special Economic Zone, Iranian expertise remains valuable. Disrupting that partnership weakens one of the logistical pillars supporting Russia's war effort. For Kiev, the destruction of Iranian weapons infrastructure is therefore more than a regional development. It is a strategic windfall, the theater of military prestige. There is also a symbolic dimension to the Iranian conflict. During the strikes against Iranian air defense systems, American and Israeli aircraft operated with relative freedom in Iranian airspace. Many of those systems were derived from Russian technology. For Ukrainian observers, this carries a certain grim satisfaction. Russia has long promoted its air defense capabilities as among the most advanced in the world. Watching those systems dismantled by Western aircraft reinforces Kiev's argument that Russian military technology is less formidable than advertised. Symbolism matters in wartime. It shapes perceptions of power and competence. Each demonstration of Western superiority undermines the aura of Russian military prestige. Ukraine's unexpected expertise. Another potential opportunity arises from Ukraine's unique experience with drone warfare. Few countries on Earth have faced Iranian-designed drones as frequently as Ukraine. Russian forces launch them nightly against Ukrainian cities, forcing Kiev to develop sophisticated interception techniques. These methods, combining radar detection, electronic warfare, and mobile air defense teams, have turned Ukrainian soldiers into some of the world's most experienced counter-drone operators. Now similar drones are appearing across the Middle East, sensing an opening. Zelensky has proposed an unusual diplomatic offer. Ukraine could share its drone interception expertise. With Middle Eastern countries facing Iranian attacks, the proposal is more than a gesture of solidarity. It is a calculated attempt to expand Ukraine's diplomatic network. Several Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have maintained cautious neutrality in the Russia-Ukraine war. By offering practical assistance, Kiev hopes to cultivate goodwill, and encourage these states to use their relationships with Moscow to push for a ceasefire. Whether the strategy will succeed remains uncertain. But it illustrates Zelensky's persistent effort to transform Ukraine from a passive recipient of aid into an active contributor to global security. The Gulf's diplomatic role. The Gulf states occupy an intriguing position in the Ukraine conflict. Unlike many Western countries, they have avoided taking strong sides. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have instead presented themselves as mediators capable of maintaining dialogue with both Kyiv and Moscow. This neutrality grants them influence. If these countries perceive Ukraine as a useful partner in defending against Iranian drones, they may become more willing to advocate Ukrainian interests in diplomatic discussions with Russia. Zelensky's proposal, offering Ukrainian drone specialists in exchange for a Russian ceasefire, reflects this logic. It transforms Ukraine's wartime experience into diplomatic currency. In an international system increasingly defined by transactional relationships, such currency can be valuable. The risk of strategic overlap, yet even these potential advantages cannot fully offset the broader strategic risk facing Ukraine. Modern geopolitics increasingly resembles a web of interconnected crises. Conflicts in one region spill on others through alliances, supply chains, and political attention. The Iranian war is unlikely to remain confined to the Middle East. Energy markets may fluctuate. Defense production priorities may shift. Diplomatic agendas may change. For Ukraine, each of these dynamics carries potential consequences. If oil prices surge due to instability in the Persian Gulf, Western governments may face economic pressures that complicate further aid packages. If defense industries prioritize replenishing stockpiles used in the Middle East, deliveries to Ukraine may slow. Wars rarely exist in isolation. They overlap, interact, and compete. Zelensky's strategic balancing act. Faced with these uncertainties, Zelensky must perform a delicate balancing act. Publicly, he cannot appear anxious about the Iranian conflict. Expressing too much concern would signal vulnerability and potentially undermine Western confidence in Ukraine's resilience. Privately, however, Ukrainian officials are undoubtedly calculating the implications. Kyiv's strategy over the past 3 years has depended on maintaining Ukraine's visibility within Western political discourse. Every speech, diplomatic visit, and international summit has served the same purpose, reminding the world that Ukraine's war remains urgent. The Middle Eastern crisis threatens to disrupt that narrative, if headlines shift permanently toward Iran. Ukraine may struggle to sustain the same level of political engagement from Western capitals. The psychology of global crises. There is also a psychological dimension to the problem. Human attention tends to gravitate toward novelty. A war that has persisted for several years inevitably loses some of its emotional immediacy. Even dramatic events, missile strikes, battlefield advances, begin to feel routine. A new conflict, by contrast, commands fascination. Television screens fill with unfamiliar maps. Analysts debate fresh scenarios. Politicians issue urgent statements. For a time, the new crisis has become the center of global conversation. Ukraine's war risks becoming background noise. This does not mean Western governments will abandon Kyiv. But it does mean that sustaining political momentum may become more difficult. The long war problem, underlying all these concerns, is a deeper strategic truth. Prolonged wars test alliances. At the outset of the conflict, Western unity behind Ukraine appeared remarkably strong. Sanctions against Russia were imposed with unprecedented speed. Military assistance flowed rapidly, but unity forged in crisis often weakens over time. Domestic politics intrude. Economic costs accumulate. Governments change. Each new crisis forces policymakers to reconsider priorities. The Iranian conflict therefore arrives at a moment when Western support for Ukraine is already undergoing subtle adjustments. Aid continues, but debates about sustainability have grown louder. If the Middle Eastern war expands, those debates may intensify. A conflict without end. For now, Zelensky has struck a cautious tone, insisting that it is too early to judge how the Iranian conflict will affect Ukraine. That caution is understandable. Wars evolve unpredictably. The confrontation with Iran might conclude quickly, allowing global attention to return to Europe. Alternatively, it could expand into a prolonged regional struggle that dominated international politics for years. much depends on how decisively the United States and Israel can achieve their objectives, and how fiercely Iran chooses to resist. In either case, Ukraine will continue fighting its own war, the uncomfortable truth. Yet the uncomfortable truth remains that global crises rarely distribute attention evenly. Some conflicts capture the world's imagination, others fade into the background. Strategic significance alone does not determine which wars command the spotlight. Narrative, spectacle, and political convenience all play their roles. For Zelensky, the Iranian war represents precisely the kind of geopolitical distraction he has long feared. Not because it directly threatens Ukraine's battlefield position, but because it alters the hierarchy of global priorities, and in international politics, hierarchy matters. A war in the shadow of another. If the conflict with Iran drags on for months, or years, Ukraine may find itself fighting a war increasingly overshadowed by events elsewhere. Aid will still arrive, but more slowly. Diplomatic attention will persist, but less intensely. Western leaders will still speak about Ukraine's importance, but with competing crises occupying their agendas, such as the fate of wars that outlast the world's patience. For Ukraine, the struggle for survival continues regardless of whether it dominates headlines. But maintaining international support has always been as vital as holding the front line. In that sense, Zelensky's greatest challenge may not lie on the battlefield at all. It may lie in the far more unpredictable arena of global attention, and attention, as every modern leader has learned, is one of the rarest resources in geopolitics.